Why did Communist Vietnam invade Communist Cambodia? In December 1978, Communist Vietnam shocked the world by launching a full-scale invasion of its neighbor, Communist Cambodia. On the surface, the conflict seemed paradoxical. Two revolutionary Marxist regimes, both having emerged victorious from decades of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles, now locked in war. But beneath the ideological veneer lay centuries of historical animosity, Cold War power struggles, and a desperate bid by Vietnam to dismantle one of the 20th century's most brutal regimes, the Khmer Rouge. A legacy of distrust, Vietnam and Cambodia's fractured past. The roots of the 1978 invasion stretch back centuries. For over 1,000 years, the relationship between the Vietnamese and Khmer Cambodian peoples oscillated between rivalry and uneasy coexistence. The Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor, once dominated mainland Southeast Asia, while Vietnam, originally concentrated in the Red River Delta, gradually expanded southward. By the 17th century, Vietnamese settlers and militias pushed into the Mekong Delta, a region historically claimed by Cambodia. This territorial absorption, coupled with periodic Vietnamese military interventions in Cambodian royal succession disputes, sowed deep resentment among Khmer nationalists. Colonial rule under France, 1863-1954, further complicated relations. As part of French Indochina, Vietnam and Cambodia were administered as separate territories, but Vietnamese officials often held mid-level bureaucratic roles in Cambodia, reinforcing perceptions of Vietnamese dominance. After World War II, independence movements in both countries diverged sharply. Vietnam's communist leaders, under Ho Chi Minh, sought to unify the country through revolution, while Cambodia's Norodom Sihanouk navigated a delicate neutrality during the Cold War. Crucially, many Cambodian nationalists viewed Vietnam's growing power, even under a communist banner, as a threat to their sovereignty. Communist brothers or ideological enemies? By 1975, both Vietnam and Cambodia had communist governments, but their ideologies and priorities starkly diverged. Vietnam's Communist Party, led by figures like Le Duan, aligned with the Soviet Union and pursued a pragmatic socialist model, emphasizing industrialization and rebuilding after the devastation of the Vietnam War. Cambodia, however, fell under the control of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, a Maoist-inspired regime that rejected modernity and sought to create an agrarian utopia through radical social engineering. The Khmer Rouge's extreme ideology placed it at odds with Hanoi. Pol Pot distrusted Vietnam, its historical influence in Cambodia, and accused Vietnamese communists of betraying Marxist principles by collaborating with the USSR, which the Khmer Rouge viewed as revisionist. Vietnam, in turn, saw Pol Pot's regime as reckless and dangerous, particularly after the Khmer Rouge began purging Cambodian communists with ties to Hanoi, border clashes, and the genocide next door. Tensions escalated in 1977 when Khmer Rouge forces launched cross-border raids into Vietnam, massacring civilians in villages along the disputed frontier. Pol Pot's regime justified these attacks by reviving historical claims to the Mekong Delta and accusing Vietnam of encroaching on Cambodian territory. For Vietnam, still recovering from the US war and struggling with economic hardship, the raids were both a humanitarian crisis and a strategic threat. Meanwhile, inside Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge had begun exterminating perceived enemies of the revolution. Between 1975 and 1979, an estimated 1.7 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the population, died from execution, forced labor, or starvation. While the world largely ignored the genocide, Vietnam, hosting over 150,000 Cambodian refugees, faced mounting pressure to act. Cold War alliances, China versus the USSR, The conflict became a proxy battleground for Cold War powers. China, seeking to counter Soviet influence in Asia, became the Khmer Rouge's primary backer, providing weapons and diplomatic support. Vietnam, meanwhile, solidified its alliance with the USSR, signing a treaty of friendship and cooperation in November 1978. This pact guaranteed Soviet economic and military aid, emboldening Hanoi to take action against Cambodia. For Vietnam, the invasion was not solely about stopping Pol Pot. It was also a strategic move to weaken China's foothold in Southeast Asia. By overthrowing the Khmer Rouge, Hanoi aimed to replace a Chinese-aligned regime with a pro-Vietnamese government, thereby securing its western flank and asserting regional dominance. Operation 719, the invasion of Cambodia. On December 25, 1978, 150,000 Vietnamese troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, crossed into Cambodia. They were joined by the Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation, KUFNS, a group of Khmer Rouge defectors and Cambodian communists opposed to Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge, though numerically large, lacked modern weaponry and tactical cohesion. Within weeks, Vietnamese forces captured Phnom Penh on January 7, 1979, forcing Pol Pot and his inner circle to flee to the Thai-Cambodian border. Vietnam installed a new government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, PRK, led by KUFNS leader Heng Samrin. While many Cambodians welcomed the end of Khmer Rouge atrocities, the international response was polarized. The United Nations, influenced by China and Western nations, including the US, which opposed Vietnam's Soviet ties, refused to recognize the PRK and continued to seat the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government until 1993. Aftermath, occupation, resistance, and legacy. Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia lasted a decade, marked by guerrilla warfare with Khmer Rouge remnants and international isolation. China retaliated in February 1979 by invading northern Vietnam, though the brief conflict ended in stalemate. Domestically, Vietnam's economy buckled under the strain of maintaining 100,000 troops in Cambodia while facing US-led sanctions. By the late 1980s, shifting geopolitics, including Soviet reforms and China's willingness to engage diplomatically, paved the way for Vietnam's withdrawal in 1989. The 1991 Paris Peace Accords finally ended the conflict, leading to UN-supervised elections and the eventual dissolution of the Khmer Rouge in the 1990s. Historians debate the invasion's morality. Critics argue Vietnam's occupation replaced one authoritarian regime with another and prolonged Cambodia's suffering. Supporters contend it halted a genocide that the international community chose to ignore. Today, Cambodia officially recognizes Vietnam's role in toppling the Khmer Rouge, though anti-Vietnamese sentiment persists among segments of its population. Conclusion: a collision of history and realpolitik. The Vietnam-Cambodia War was never a simple clash between communist allies. It was the culmination of centuries of rivalry, amplified by Cold War geopolitics and the Khmer Rouge's unique brand of extremism. For Vietnam, the invasion was a calculated decision to eliminate a hostile regime, counter Chinese influence, and assert itself as Southeast Asia's dominant power. For Cambodia, it marked the end of a genocide, but the beginning of a turbulent decade under foreign occupation. The conflict underscores a grim reality. In a world divided by ideology and power struggles, even the most horrifying atrocities can become pawns in a larger game. Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia remains a controversial chapter in history, one that challenges simplistic narratives of good versus evil and reminds us that the costs of stopping tyranny are often measured in blood, diplomacy, and unintended consequences.